Soldier of Fortune magazine calls itself the Journal of Professional Adventurers, and most of its articles tell about them and others who are mercenaries. Published for over a year, Soldier of Fortune's publisher, Bob Brown, claims a circulation of over 10,000, and the typical reader is 29 to 39 years old. Brown, who is an ex-Green Beret colonel, says 56% of them are either in the military or are combat veterans. Some of the magazine's articles are very graphic, like this one, which does not leave out a thing while giving instructions on how to kill a sentry.
I would suggest for certainly a large number of our readers who will not be involved in sentry removal, so to speak, at any point in time in their life, it's simply a matter of escapist reading, if you will. On the other hand, there may be, some of our readers, although a much smaller proportion, that might be.
Presumably, the magazine's ads also try to reach the pro. There are dozens and dozens of how-to-do-it books offered for sale, from CIA and Army handbooks to modern knife fighting techniques and how to make a silencer. And the array of mercenary-style weapons for sale legally, such as blowguns, machine guns, and commando knives, is very extensive.
The ads, really, the items that appear there are advertised elsewhere. I think it causes such interest in people that pick up the magazine for the first time because they see all these ads in one place, so to speak. That in conjunction with the general nature of the magazine.
Soldier of Fortune is also getting a lot of mileage from the fighting in Africa, and even offers interviews with military officials there who tell how to join their armies. And the classified section has such interesting items as this one. Group of mercenaries for sale to foreign government who will accept suicide missions. Ike Siemens, Channel 4 News.
If you grew up in the 80s, 90s, or maybe even the early 2000s, then you probably remember Soldier of Fortune magazine. This was a publication for the manliest of men. It was mostly known for gun advertisements, graphic photographs that realistically depicted the gruesomeness of war, and hard-to-believe stories written by wannabe tough guys. But what if I told you that Soldier of Fortune had a hidden agenda this whole time? What if I told you that it was propaganda created by the government to get civilians to have a more favorable outlook on mercenaries and an even more unfavorable outlook on communism? If you find that hard to believe, well, let's see how you feel by the end of this video. What's up, YouTube? I am a Stone-Faced 8. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about. Before we get into this video, I just want to say thank you to anyone who's left a comment, given a like, and most definitely a huge thank you to everyone who subscribed to the channel so far. All of that stuff means so much to me, and it keeps me motivated. It's easy to subscribe to a channel that already has hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So if you subscribe to this brand new channel, you are a real one. To anyone not subscribed, what are you doing, bro? If you like deep dive videos that don't cut corners and aren't just reading from a Wikipedia page, come on over here, man. I'm putting in serious work digging through the dustiest, most decrepit corners of the internet to bring y'all this dope content you can't find anywhere else. Trust me, you don't want to miss out on this stuff, man, I promise. So please like, please subscribe, because it's only gonna keep coming. Also, the focus of this video changed dramatically after I started digging deeper into the history of Soldier of Fortune, and because of that, I'm going to be dropping a bonus episode after this one that goes into the murder for hire cases associated with Soldier of Fortune. Because the murder for hire cases are the least interesting thing about Soldier of Fortune, as you're about to see. That should let you know something. Murder for hire cases, not as interesting as what we're exploring today. But enough of all the formalities. Let's dive into the absolutely wild ass story that is Soldier of Fortune magazine and its founder, Robert Brown. In the early 1970s, Robert Brown, who was born in 1932, had just returned home from the Vietnam War. He served as a captain in the U.S. Army Special Forces, which is most commonly known as the Green Berets. But I was speaking on what Robert was doing prior to and during Vietnam a little bit later. Robert has been described as the world's oldest 7th grader, and in a Playboy magazine article about Soldier of Fortune, he was called the Hugh Hefner of violence. I don't even know how to process that. Everything I've read about him has led me to believe he's kind of like Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights, if Ricky Bobby had gotten into guns and warfare instead of race cars. he definitely has a charge into danger, blow shit up for the fun of it sort of mentality, which I personally think is cool as hell. After having been placed on reserve status by the Army due to the scoliosis and partial deafness he sustained from being hit by 14 fragments from a mortar shell in the war, Robert Brown settled down in Boulder, Colorado, and decided he wanted to try his hand at journalism. And just to give you an idea of what kind of person we're talking about, Robert once described Boulder, Colorado as 25 square miles of hippy-dippy bullshit surrounded by reality. And he once said he went to a gun range to cleanse his soul. So yeah, that's what we're dealing with here. His first company was called Panther Press, which he used to publish reprints of Army weapon and field manuals that he then sold to the public, because I guess there's a market for that sort of thing. This venture caught the attention of the government, and he was brought to court. But it wasn't for the reasons you're probably thinking. The government wasn't mad that Robert was reprinting and selling government publications. Nah, they thought that Panther Press was connected to the Black Panther Party. You know, the African American Revolutionary Communist Organization founded in the late 60s in California. Yeah, that Black Panther Party. The government thought Robert was reprinting government weapon manuals on behalf of that group, and they said, oh fuck no. Once Robert cleared up the confusion and probably made it clear he wasn't fond of communists himself, the government quietly dropped the case and allowed Robert and Panther Press to continue operations. In 1975, Robert took a trip to the unrecognized African state of Rhodesia, where he hooked up with a Vietnam War buddy who was serving in the British South African Police. And just for clarification, the British South African Police is not in the country of South Africa, it's in Rhodesia. But while in Rhodesia, Robert learned that the Rhodesian army was in desperate need of white soldiers. See, in 1960, Britain had decided to give independence to all of its African colonies, but only by majority rule. This meant that a colony would not get its independence until that colony was being governed by the native Africans, not the white immigrants who were still living there and currently holding all the power. Naturally, this pissed off the white immigrants in Rhodesia. Nobody's happy to hear that they're about to lose all their privileges and status. So what do the white immigrants do? They declared their own independence without the consent of Britain, and they named their new state Rhodesia. This led to the Rhodesian Bush War, where the predominantly white Rhodesian army fought against several African guerrilla forces, including the Soviet-backed Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army and the Chinese-backed Zimbabwe African National Army.
The troops are landed as near to the target as the terrain will allow. They are either dropped off in sticks of 4 men each, all round the area, or, as in this case, together. They form into extended line and sweep towards the enemy. A second airstrike is called in.
Yes, I'm fighting to preserve a way of life, to maintain a home, to live in this country generally under what I consider to be an acceptable system, which is basically Christian and capitalistic. If the rest of Africa is an example of the alternatives to this particular system, and if that is what communism represents in general, then I'm going to be against it until the day I finally go.
The problem is that the white Rhodesians were significantly outnumbered by the Africans, and this is where Robert Brown comes in. Robert decided he would create a new magazine and use that magazine to recruit Americans to become mercenaries in the Rhodesian Bush War. Now, where exactly Robert got the money to start this new publication isn't entirely clear, because he gave multiple different sources for the startup money at various times. So he either got the money by selling his share in Panther Press, got a loan from his mother, or he got the money by selling overseas employment packets for the Rhodesian army, or some combination of all three. We do know that he did actually sell those employment packets, and basically those were enlistment papers needed to join the Rhodesian army. Either way, he was able to obtain the funds needed to start this new magazine, and that magazine would be called Soldier of Fortune, the Journal of Professional Adventurers. He also founded Omega Group Limited, which was the parent company he used to publish Soldier of Fortune, and the name Omega came from the anti-Castro group known as Omega 7. But more on Robert's connections with Fidel Castro a little bit later. Robert Brown's true motivations for assisting Rhodesia in their war have been debated. Socialist historian Kyle Burke hints at Robert Brown being a racist and a misogynist. Burke believed that Soldier of Fortune was created and became popular due to white men rebelling against the civil rights and feminist movements of the 60s. Burke believed that Robert Brown and those who were enticed by Rhodesia were only interested because Rhodesia presented itself as a place where a man could still be a man, a place where women and blacks still knew their place. I personally don't think that Robert Brown was motivated by these factors. I think Robert just wanted to fuck some shit up. In his book, I Am Soldier of Fortune, Robert literally has a chapter called Rhodesia, the Land of Mercs and Hired Guns. As you'll see throughout the course of this video, Robert was more than willing to fight whenever, wherever, and with whomever. Robert would shoot at Russians, Laotians, Africans, Afghans, Nicaraguans, Salvadorans, whoever. Bonus points if they were communists. Now, obviously Robert was born in 1932, and it would be damn near impossible for a white man born in 1930s America to not have at least a little bit of racism in him. But I think Robert's love of combat far outweighed any racist ideologies he may have had. Besides, the real question we need to be asking isn't why was he fighting in Rhodesia, but how was he getting away with blatantly violating U.S. foreign policy? America has something called the Neutrality Act, and this act prohibits any American from enlisting in the service of any foreign state as a soldier. Basically, it's illegal for an American to become a mercenary. Funnily enough, though, the penalty for becoming a mercenary was surprisingly light, at least in the 80s or in the 70s. You'd think the punishment would be like 20 years in prison or something, but actually the max punishment is just a $3,000 fine and 3 years in prison. And that's kind of wild to me. We used to hang pirates for doing the exact same thing, but for some reason, mercenaries get a slap on the wrist. I don't get it. Either way, Robert Brown was clearly in violation of this act. And I'm not the only one to think so either, because in 1976 and again in 1979, Colorado Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder and others called for Robert to be investigated by the government for the activities he was engaging in with Soldier of Fortune magazine. The U.S. Department of Justice responded by basically saying, yeah, he's engaging in some sus activities, and we'll continue to investigate him until he stops engaging in those sus activities. That was it. The DOJ said, we'll keep an eye on him. And they continue to let him do his thing, which, again, was openly violate U.S. foreign policy. They never charged him with violating the Neutrality Act. Ever. Not only that, but while Robert Brown was fighting in Rhodesia, America has said that under no circumstance would they ever recognize Rhodesian independence.
Good evening and welcome to The Advocates. I'm Marilyn Berger. Tonight we're going to examine our policy towards the newly elected government of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. In 1965, the white government in Rhodesia unilaterally declared its independence from Britain. That declaration sparked a guerrilla movement, which grew into open warfare about 6 years ago. The guerrilla forces are joined under the Patriotic Front, led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. The United States never recognized the government, and since 1968 has participated in United Nations sanctions against Rhodesia.
Now, why would the government let someone openly be a mercenary and also invite other Americans to become mercenaries for a state that America wasn't even fucking with? Makes you wonder, right? Keep that in mind. Soldier of Fortune ran ads inviting Americans to join the Rhodesian war effort, and Robert even worked directly with the Rhodesian Army's chief recruiting officer, Major Nick Lampert. Lampert was allowed to write articles for Soldier of Fortune, which served as obvious propaganda designed to persuade Americans to come fight for Rhodesia. He once wrote, quote, Rhodesia has many things to offer. Good Rhodesian beer, a friendly populace, and what I would describe as a free and easy, unhurried way of life. Lots of wide open spaces, end quote. He also stated that it would be easy for Americans to find wives in Rhodesia and that the black people still knew their place there. One article stated, quote, what we have here is an ideal core of white people who are able to raise the standards of living among the Africans. Without us, conditions will decline rapidly, end quote. Bro was like, we got beer, bitches, land, and you ain't got to worry about no uppity darkies getting in your way. Come on down to Rhodesia. It's a white man's paradise. And this strategy did kind of work because Americans actually enlisted to fight for Rhodesia. One American, named Mike Kelso, joined the Rhodesian Light Infantry in 1977 via an ad he saw in Soldier of Fortune. He was previously enlisted in the American Army but left after 4 years because he didn't like the boredom of serving in the military during peacetime. Bro just couldn't wait to kill something. He fought with the infantry for 15 months, but he eventually deserted in 1979 after he realized Rhodesia couldn't possibly win the war. He was quoted as saying, quote, it's one thing for a professional soldier to risk his life and lose it in support of his own country, but when the battle is clearly lost and all hope is gone, well, we fought the good fight, did what they asked us to do, but when it became obvious the war was lost, dying didn't make much sense, end quote. This sentiment must have been shared among many American mercenaries in Rhodesia because Soldier of Fortune reported, quote, the majority found the routine too rough to last more than a few months. The desertion rate among the American citizens who have joined the Rhodesian Army over the last 2 years is estimated to run at about 80%, end quote. 80% were deserting the army. Talk about low morale. One major issue was, you shouldn't be recruiting soldiers from a magazine. While some of the men who enlisted actually had military experience, most of the men who came from America did not. They were just pretend soldiers who watched too many John Wayne movies and were not at all prepared to face the horrors of actual combat, hence the 80% desertion rate. One of the first Americans to join the Rhodesian Army was Vietnam vet John Allen Corey. In 1975, he wrote a letter and said, quote, since coming to Rhodesia, I have often heard people remark that it's inevitable for this country and all of Southern Africa to go the same way as the other former colonies of the North. This is rubbish and only indicates a lack of fighting spirit, guts, and the will to rule a civilization built by better men, end quote. Shortly after writing this letter, he was killed in action by those same men he claimed he was better than. Another problem for Rhodesia, like I said, was that the white Rhodesians were significantly outnumbered. The white population only made up 5% of the total population in that area. Most of the white residents of Rhodesia had immigrated between 1955 and 1960, and this war was taking place just 15 years later. The white immigrants didn't have deep roots in Rhodesia like white immigrants in other parts of Africa like the Congo or South Africa. And to make matters worse, 13,000 whites were fleeing Rhodesia annually during the Bush Wars. And the Rhodesians were fighting against two completely different armies, with both of them being equipped and financed by large countries, those countries being China and Russia. Whereas the Rhodesians were rebelling against the British, so outside of the mercenaries Robert Brown and Soldier of Fortune were able to recruit, the Rhodesians didn't have any backup whatsoever. I have no idea why they even thought they had a snowball's chance in hell of winning this war. And obviously, they didn't win. There was a ceasefire on December 21st of 1979, and in March of 1980, the African-controlled country of Zimbabwe was founded after elections were held. But even though the state of Rhodesia was no more, Soldier of Fortune and Robert Brown were just getting started. The 80s were a wild time for America, and a large reason why was because of what the government was involved in. The 80s was all about preventing the evil spread of communism, and the Soldier of Fortune team was eager to spearhead these efforts. Robert Brown and Soldier of Fortune hopped all around the world like a platinum-selling K-pop band on tour, but I'm only going to speak on the most interesting moments for the sake of keeping this video at a reasonable length. In October of 1979, Robert writes in his book that he was having dinner with an arms dealer at a Chinese restaurant in Washington, D.C. Robert learns from this arms dealer that the Soviets are working on a brand new rifle and brand new ammunition to replace the AK-47 and the 7.62 round. The arms dealer tells Robert that this information is only known by those in the most clandestine circles of the U.S. intelligence community. I'll be honest, man. This whole story sounds like complete bullshit. And that brings me to a quick point I want to make. Robert Brown does have a book that chronicles the adventures of the Soldier of Fortune team, but I do not consider Robert to be a reliable narrator. Now, this is partly because he had a very long career in the military, which means he is almost certainly a master of misdirection and bullshitting, but also, this is crazy as fuck, so I wouldn't be surprised if he made up a lot of shit just to make the story sound cooler than it actually was. I say all that to say, I tried to stay away from using his book as a source of information. I only used it to fill in gaps for information I couldn't find anywhere else. I don't believe that Robert Brown found out about a new Russian assault rifle from a mysterious arms dealer in a Chinese restaurant in DC. But either way, Soldier of Fortune did send a team member to Afghanistan in April of 1980 to retrieve this new assault rifle and its ammunition. The firearm turned out to be the, at the time, brand new AK-74, and the ammunition was the new 5.45 by 39mm Comblak round. Soldier of Fortune member Galen Gear, who was a former Marine and Vietnam vet, is credited with having gone to Afghanistan to obtain these items. He claims he was in Afghanistan for 11 days and that he climbed over various mountains and crossed numerous deserts with the local Mujahideen in order to accomplish his mission. And I don't know if all of that is true, but I did find a Boston Globe article from the CIA website that was dated from June of 1980. And it does credit Galen Gear as the guy who brought some Soviet stuff back. The article states that Gear recovered, quote, a nerve gas filter, a handheld missile launcher, sticks of an incendiary material similar to napalm, and several rounds from the new Soviet assault rifle, the AKS-74, end quote. What's odd, though, is that Robert Brown tries to make it seem as if Soldier of Fortune and the CIA were at odds or something. He says that the CIA would have been humiliated at the fact Soldier of Fortune was able to recover Soviet items that even they were unable to obtain. And I do not buy that at all. I'm supposed to believe that a magazine publication has the means to infiltrate Afghanistan and recover brand new, never before seen Soviet equipment, but the CIA couldn't? Doesn't make any sense. But more on that later. In September of 1980, Soldier of Fortune, this time with Robert Brown himself, went to Pakistan to retrieve more Soviet equipment. This time, they're asked to do so by the Army's Foreign Science and Technology Center. According to Robert's book, the government promised to pay Soldier of Fortune for each piece of equipment they brought back. They wanted 10,000 rounds of the AK-74 ammo, promising to pay $1 per round, an AGS-17 grenade launcher for $65,000, a container of nerve gas for $250,000, and a container of incapacitating gas for $125,000. While in Afghanistan, the Soldier of Fortune team also trained the Mujahideen and even assisted them in attacking a Russian fort in 1982. Brown writes that these same freedom fighters they trained and aided in the 80s would later go on to become the Taliban that America would fight in the war on terror after 9/11. America is truly the king at creating his own ops. And do you know who also trained the Mujahideen? The CIA. Surely we won't see Soldier of Fortune training anti-communist guerrilla fighters right next to the CIA in this video again, will we? Spoiler alert, We absolutely will. Soldier of Fortune magazine ran ads promising to take would-be soldiers into Afghanistan. The city of Peshawar, which is on the Pakistani-Afghan border, was described as being full of wannabe tough guys who bragged about heading into Afghanistan to be soldiers. Unsurprisingly, very few actually went into the city, and of those that did, few survived and returned. Those Afghans might be wearing sandals and man dresses, but they will not hesitate to smoke an infidel. The Middle East wasn't the only hotbed for communist activity in the world. With Cuba being a significant communist stronghold, Central America was experiencing its own Red Scare in the 80s. America was terrified of what they called the domino effect of communism, which suggests that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would soon follow. Central America is in the United States' backyard, so obviously the US government wasn't going for any communist funny business near its borders. El Salvador was one of a handful of Central American countries that were on the verge of being overrun by communists. Robert Brown went down to El Salvador with his team of Soldier of Fortune mercenaries in 1983. They provided training for the forces of fascist leader Roberto Dubuisson. El Salvador was in the middle of a civil war, and Dubuisson was certainly not making this situation any better, like, at all. In March of 1980, Dubuisson ordered the assassination of Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero. This was because the Catholic Church held a lot of sway over El Salvador, as it does for much of Latin America, and Romero was calling for an end to the political killings that were taking place, and he even wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter asking him to stop giving financial and military aid to El Salvador's corrupt government. Now, Dubuisson was the leader of that corrupt government, so he was the one ordering the death squads to kill political opponents, and obviously he benefited greatly from the aid he was receiving from the Americans, which totaled to $5 billion in economic aid and $1 billion in military aid. Sending billions of dollars in aid in the 80s to a fascist government is crazy. So naturally, Dubuisson wasn't really feeling all that shit Archbishop Romero was talking about him and his regime. So he had him killed. This outraged not just El Salvador, but most of the Catholic world, including America. Throughout the 80s, the American government acted as if they had no idea that Dubuisson was behind Archbishop Romero's death. But in November of 1993, several governmental agencies, including the CIA, released 12,000 documents that revealed they were well aware that Dubuisson was behind it the entire time. The reason America was funding, supporting, and lying for Dubuisson was because he was fighting against the communist Salvadoran political party known as the FMLN, or the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, who were being supported by the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And the Sandinistas were being backed by the Cubans.
Guerrillas say their major arms supplier is the Salvadorian army. Rebel raids and attacks, they say, have secured them everything from this mortar to boots and uniforms and, above all, rifles. The rebels deny the U.S. charge that Nicaragua and the Soviet bloc are major suppliers of arms. The overwhelming majority of arms observed being carried by the guerrillas were made in the United States.
So even though Dubuisson and his fascist regime were killing political opponents by the hundreds and assassinating archbishops, he wasn't a communist. And that was the most important thing to America at the time. They would literally pick fascism over communism. And I mean, they're both terrible, but that's still kind of crazy. Either way, this is who Robert Brown and the Soldier of Fortune Mercs were assisting in El Salvador. Soldier of Fortune would accompany the death squads as they went on missions to kill political rivals, but they told the Washington Post that they never fired their weapons and that they only went with handguns for self-defense purposes. But I read that Robert Brown had gotten the nickname Blowtorch Bob while in El Salvador due to his torture methods, so I'm not sure they were entirely hands-off. Soldier of Fortune did such a good job that Dubuisson stated he wanted fewer U.S. military advisors and more mercenaries. Mercenaries have fewer scruples about silly things like war crimes and human rights violations, so I'm sure Dubuisson preferred their company over the heavily restrictive U.S. military. However, the American government soon got tired of the bad press that came with Roberto Dubuisson and his indiscriminate killings. So in 1984, elections were held in El Salvador and a new leader was elected, Jose Duarte. And guess who put up $10 million towards Duarte's campaign? The CIA. Are you seeing a pattern yet? Another country in Latin America battling communism that Soldier of Fortune got involved with was Grenada. On October 25th, 1983, U.S. Rangers and Marines invaded the island to dismantle the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, or PRG, which was established by the communist New Jewel movement after Grenada had been granted its independence by the British. The American press was not allowed on the island until the 5th day after the invasion began, which was when all the fighting was over. This is pretty unusual because the press is usually allowed in active war zones, even in the modern day. It makes you wonder what the government was trying to prevent from being blasted on the news. But one Soldier of Fortune editor named Jim Graves was overheard speaking loudly in a Boulder, Colorado bar, claiming that Soldier of Fortune was the only publication allowed in Grenada on the day the invasion began. He also claimed that while they were there, they were able to obtain documents from the New Jewel movement's headquarters that exposed links between American politicians and the communist New Jewel movement. Basically, the documents showed that there were congressmen who were assisting the very same communists that American soldiers had died fighting against. Definitely not a good look. But why was Soldier of Fortune allowed access to Grenada during this invasion when no other member of the press was given that privilege? Robert Brown confirmed that Soldier of Fortune obtained those documents in his book and he sold the story to Time magazine, but he claims they weren't allowed access to the island until the 5th day like everyone else. And it was actually other members of the press who snuck into Grenada on the 1st day of the invasion, not the Soldier of Fortune team, despite a member of his own team saying otherwise. He claims they were able to get those sensitive documents because every other person on the island has simply overlooked them. No other members of the press, none of the numerous military and intelligence personnel. Only the Soldier of Fortune team has spotted those documents. Again, I find what Robert says to be hard to believe. How is it that Soldier of Fortune is able to do what no other organization is able to accomplish time and time again? And it's always just by pure coincidence. Seems pretty weird. But I will say that once again, wherever Soldier of Fortune goes, the CIA is somewhere in the picture. And in this case, it was actually the CIA who had gathered intelligence about the military strength of Grenada and Cuba in order to prepare the US military for the invasion. However, their estimates were off because they believed there would only be around 600 soldiers on the island, but when the invasion began, the US realized there were closer to 1,100 soldiers defending the island. After the invasion, the U.S. intelligence community came to the conclusion that someone must have leaked the invasion plans to Cuba. Perhaps it was one of those Congress people mentioned in those documents the Soldier of Fortune team found? Who's to say? The last Latin American country I want to speak on is the big one, the famous one, Contras versus Sandinistas, Nicaragua. Yup. Soldier of Fortune is right in the middle of this one as well. A lot of you are most familiar with this conflict because of the role it played in America's crack epidemic. And you probably know the CIA has its fingerprints all over this one. The Nicaraguan Revolution was fought between 1981 and 1990. The combatants were the Sandinista National Liberation Front and the Contras. The Sandinistas were the communist political party that had overthrown the previous regime and had taken control of Nicaragua in 1979. And the Contras were the right-wing militia that was waging guerrilla warfare against the Sandinistas. With Nicaragua being in Central America and being controlled by communists, obviously the American government was going to get involved. But there was one big problem preventing America from doing so, and that problem was the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment was a series of amendments passed between 1982 and 1986 that limited the American government in assisting the Contras. Prior to 1982, America was aiding the Contras as much as it wanted to. That was until the Contras were exposed as having committed human rights violations. The amendment's main goal was to prevent the CIA from funding the Contras, so the Reagan administration took that to mean that only U.S. intelligence agencies weren't allowed to fund the Contras. So they got around that by channeling funds through the National Security Council instead, since the NSC wasn't labeled as an intelligence agency. That sneaky little Ronnie Reagan. But unfortunately for him, later amendments specified that America could not send any funds whatsoever if those funds were for military or paramilitary operations. Ultimately, this would cause way more problems than it solved. It's kind of like when your parents tried to be really strict on you and prevent you from doing the dumb shit that you wanted to do, but instead of listening to them and changing your behavior, you just started getting sneakier and doing even more risky shit behind their backs. Yeah, that's what happened here. I can guarantee you that Ronald Reagan was not going to let some pesky laws that were designed to prevent human rights violations get in the way of him killing communists. One of the ways the CIA secretly funded the Contras was through selling cocaine in American inner cities, as you all know. The Contras would give the CIA coke, the CIA would sell that coke to distributors in America, then the CIA would use that money to fund the Contras.
To keep the Contras armed and fighting, according to the Tower Commission, the White House started the secret weapons network in 1984. Those organizing the gun shipments included former and current CIA operatives. But what wasn't in the Tower Commission report is that among those recruited to fly weapons to Central America were known drug traffickers.
We're talking about millions and millions of dollars.
Do you really believe the government decided to get into the drug business in order to pay for the Contras? The American government.
As incredulous as it may sound, I believe that not only decided to get into it, I think they orchestrated the whole thing.
The CIA also laundered money through countries like Guatemala, Taiwan, Venezuela, Argentina, and a country that I'm not going to name, to get money and materials to the Contras. But those are just the indirect funding of the war. The CIA also took a hands-on approach to fighting the Sandinistas. First of all, it needs to be understood that the Contras themselves were a CIA creation. The Contras were primarily made up of two militias, the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, which operated out of Honduras along the border to Nicaragua, and the Democratic Revolutionary Alliance, which was on the Costa Rica-Nicaragua border.
This is the U.S. military headquarters at Palmarola in central Honduras. U.S. spokesmen say American aircraft based here are already lifting Honduran troops and supplies forward close to the battle area. That is a pocket of Honduran territory that points into Nicaragua. It is here that the Contra base camps are located, and it is here that at least 2 Sandinista battalions, about 1,500 men, attacked over the weekend. These Contra troops have been fighting the Sandinistas 4 days, and according to U.S. intelligence sources, are whipping them badly. U.S. analysts believe the Sandinistas made 2 tremendous mistakes. First, they apparently believe President Reagan would eventually win his battle in Congress to give the Contras military aid. And so they decided to try to destroy the Contras before the help arrived. By not waiting until a crucial House vote next month, they have helped the president make his case.
The CIA organized both of these militias and trained them in guerrilla warfare tactics. They were also trained by the Army Special Forces, who would even accompany the Contras on missions. Allegedly. And you know who was a Green Beret, right? Yup, Robert Brown. He and the Soldier of Fortune team were in Honduras training the Contras right next to the CIA. See, I told you we'd see this happen again. Everywhere the CIA goes, Soldier of Fortune is right behind it. The Soldier of Fortune mercenaries were also given a consignment of arms from America to give to the Contras. Another way the CIA secretly aided the Contras was through World Medical Relief. Now, this was an organization that supplied medical aid to war zones, and they had a very long history with the CIA, as the agency had used World Medical Relief to supply anti-communist forces in Laos and other parts of Southeast Asia in the past. One of the leading representatives for World Medical Relief was Air Force General Harry Adderhall, who was the unconventional warfare editor for, you guessed it, Soldier of Fortune magazine. And this isn't the only Soldier of Fortune editor who has significant ties to the CIA. but we'll talk about that in a second. Soldier of Fortune blasted American readers with anti-Sandinista propaganda in their magazine and portrayed the Contras as freedom fighters. But I guess they forgot to mention all those human rights violations. Soldier of Fortune also ran ads promoting Americans to assist the Contras in fighting the Sandinistas. And this was because U.S. Army General John K. Singlaub, who was a founding member of the CIA, hired Robert Brown to use his magazine to recruit Americans to join and train the Contras. And you have to keep in mind that Soldier of Fortune was not some small rinky-dink magazine, man. It was one of the most popular magazines in the 70s and 80s, and they were selling 120,000 copies per month. In September of 1984, Robert Brown claimed he had sent over 100 men and $4 million in supplies to the Contras. However, the training that the Contras received from Robert Brown and his merry band of mercenaries was not the best, because all of the Contras that they had trained as spies were captured and executed by the Sandinistas. But Robert blames this on the quality of the recruits as opposed to the quality of his training. Also, I have found a link to the CIA website that was titled Soldier of Fortune Distributes CIA Manual, but when I tried to visit the page, it was unavailable. But from what I could read from the Google link, it has something to do with Nicaragua. So knowing that, the manual that Soldier of Fortune was most likely distributing was what is called the CIA Terror Manual. This was a manual drawn in comic book form that instructed the civilians of Nicaragua to engage in, acts of terrorism in order to assist the Contras in overthrowing the Sandinistas. The CIA has never openly acknowledged that they were behind this manual, but the Associated Press claims they were told by official sources that it was definitely the CIA who created it. Here's a quote pointing out what's strange about this manual. Quote, "Several features confirm its foreign origin. It casually suggests tasks that are not appropriate to the conditions of most Nicaraguans, such as methods of disrupting one's telephone service. The facial features of the saboteurs in the manual are more North American than Central American, and the Spanish in the text is different from colloquial Nicaraguan Spanish." End quote. Bruh, you know the CIA must have wanted to destroy those communists bad when they're handing out how to be terrorist comic books to the local yokels. But as you can see, Soldier of Fortune was doing all the dirty work for the CIA in Honduras and Nicaragua. And even though Soldier of Fortune covered the Nicaraguan Revolution extensively in his magazine, they only ever presented themselves as just journalists. They never mentioned the fact that they had been hired by the CIA or that they were actually training and arming the Contras themselves. I certainly hope that by now I've convinced you all that Soldier of Fortune was damn near a squad within the CIA. But in case you need some more convincing, don't worry, I got you covered. We've talked a lot about Robert Brown and his adventures with Soldier of Fortune, but what about his life before he started the magazine? This is where things get very interesting. Robert's first stint with the Army was from 1954 to 1957. During this time, Robert served as a lieutenant in the Army's Counterintelligence Corps. This group of highly trained soldiers specialized in investigating and infiltrating communist organizations. The scope of their duties often overlapped with those of the CIA, and because of this, the Counterintelligence Corps and the CIA have always maintained a very close relationship. After leaving the Army in 1957, Robert went to Boulder, Colorado and studied political science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. While working on his master's degree, he traveled to Cuba to do research for his thesis, which was titled Communist Penetration and Takeover of the Cuban Labor Movement. Robert claims that he had become sympathetic towards Fidel Castro's cause, and he claims that he even tried gun running for Castro as well. While in Cuba, he also attempted to meet up with Che Guevara and other communist revolutionaries, but he was denied entry into their ranks. Keep in mind, this was during a time when the Cubans were allowing American reporters into the mountains. But something about Robert Brown seemed off to him, so he was denied that privilege. Now, this makes no sense at all. After his trip to Cuba, Robert claimed that he finally realized Castro had always been a communist, and because of that, he chose to no longer support the Communist Party of Cuba. Yeah, none of that is making any sense whatsoever. How would Robert not have already known that Fidel Castro was a communist? That's like saying you didn't know Tom Brady played football. It's like his whole identity. I think that Robert Brown was sent down to Cuba by either the Counterintelligence Corps or the CIA to infiltrate the Communist Party of Cuba. And the whole "I'm just doing research for my college thesis" angle was merely a cover story. A cover story that the Cubans obviously were not convinced by. In 1968, Robert was apparently kicked out of the Army Special Forces, but in that same year he re-enlisted and went to Vietnam. While in Nam, he somehow got back into the Green Berets and rose to the rank of captain, where he headed a highly classified special operations unit called Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Operations Group, or MACV-SOG. Some of y'all may have heard of this unit because Frank Woods from the Black Ops video games, he served in that unit in the game. MACV-SOG was a joint venture between the Army Special Forces and the CIA. This unit was responsible for intelligence gathering, and they ran highly classified missions within various parts of Southeast Asia. Some people say they even had operations in China as well. Robert's unit was also responsible for identifying North Vietnamese political targets that would later be captured, interrogated, or even assassinated by the CIA's Phoenix program. Holding the rank of captain, Robert Brown would certainly have had lots of direct contact with the CIA. And Robert wasn't the only future Soldier of Fortune member who had direct ties to the CIA either. Soldier of Fortune had a martial arts director and editor named Michael Iconis. Soldier of Fortune presented Iconis to readers as a former Special Forces Vietnam veteran. This is kinda true, but it's certainly not the whole story. Iconis did serve in Vietnam, but he was an Army Ranger, not a Green Beret. But one thing Soldier of Fortune magazine never divulged to readers was that Iconis was also a CIA contractor. He was killed by Sandinistas on September 8, 1978 in Nicaragua due to a bomb exploding while he was in an aircraft. He was in Nicaragua serving as a military advisor for Nicaraguan President Anastasio Somoza during the revolution. He was performing these duties on behalf of the CIA. So you have a CIA asset in a foreign country providing paramilitary services for that country's government to assist them in fighting communist forces. That sounds exactly like what Robert Brown was doing in El Salvador later on in the 80s. But of course, Robert denies that he ever worked with the CIA. Now, here's one that's even more eerily similar to Robert Brown's story. Soldier of Fortune had an editor named George Washington Bacon III. Crazy name, I know. But Soldier of Fortune presented Bacon as just a former Green Beret who fought in Vietnam. This time, that part's actually true. He was Special Forces, and he fought in Nam in 1968 and 1969. But as always, Soldier of Fortune didn't reveal the whole story because George Bacon served in a recon team for MACV-SOG, the Army-CIA joint venture. During this time, it's said that he hated communists so much that he defied orders to refrain from combat. Bacon was a medic, and since the casualty rate for MACV-SOG exceeded 100%, he was ordered to stay on base since MACV-SOG couldn't afford to lose a medic. This made George Bacon highly upset, so instead of following orders, he went AWOL and left the base to sneak into a different MACV-SOG recon team, just to kill VC. After he discharged from the Army, George Bacon became a case officer for the CIA. He trained at CIA training facility Camp Perry, where apparently he annoyed his CIA handlers by carrying around his pet gerbils throughout the entirety of his training. Look, man, I don't know what it is about Vietnam, but it seems like every dude that came out that war was whacked out. But after his training, he was sent to Laos to serve in their civil war, and he was even awarded the Intelligence Star, which is the CIA's third highest award and one of the rarest valor awards given by the U.S. government. After Laos, George Bacon is said to have quit the CIA because he was, quote, so disgusted with American policy. He then went to Angola to serve as a mercenary during the Angolan War of Independence. His cover story was that he was a freelance journalist for Soldier of Fortune. Unfortunately, he died during this conflict. But you have a guy who was a Green Beret, fought in Nam, served with Mac V. Sog, hated communists, and then became a mercenary in Africa. Sounds familiar, right? Yeah, that's almost identical to Robert Brown's story. Robert even spent time in Laos after Vietnam. The only difference is that George Bacon was a known CIA officer, whereas Robert Brown wasn't. But I believe Robert Brown was a CIA officer, or at the very least, a CIA asset like Michael E. Connors. I'm not the only one to believe that either. When Robert went to El Salvador in 1983, he brought a team of mercenaries with him. Almost everyone on the team had some sort of credentials justifying their presence. On the trip, he brought Colonel Alexander McGall, who was a former Mac V. Sog member and CIA liaison officer, Captain John Early, who was a Green Beret commander, Ben Jones, who was a Merc in Rhodesia, Captain Cliff Albright, who was a pilot and also fought in Nicaragua, etc., etc. All of the guys Robert Brown brought had a history of military combat, except one dude, a guy named Thomas Reisinger. This dude has no background at all. He's just listed as medic. This man is believed to be Robert Brown's CIA handler. Why else would this random guy be headed down to El Salvador with a bunch of ex-special forces and mercenaries? And again, one of the most important points, Robert Brown consistently violated U.S. foreign policy over and over and over again. The government claimed they were investigating him, but they never brought him up on charges. They just said they'll keep investigating him until he stops breaking the law. Where they do that at? Not only that, but while he was blatantly violating foreign policy, he was promoted twice. Why would the government promote a guy who's in the Army Reserves while he's violating foreign policy? Quick history lesson, okay? After World War II, General Douglas MacArthur had his entire career destroyed after President Truman discovered that MacArthur was planning to defy U.S. foreign policy. And Truman didn't have any concrete proof that MacArthur was actually planning to defy him. Truman was just told that that was what MacArthur was trying to do. I say all of that to say, if a nationally praised and loved general was disciplined for possibly thinking about defying U.S. foreign policy, then how the fuck could a captain in the Army Reserves not only get away with blatantly and repeatedly violating foreign policy, but also be rewarded while doing so? It's because that motherfucker was CIA and he was actually following orders the whole time. Soldier of Fortune magazine was designed by the CIA to spread anti-communist propaganda and to get the average civilian to become more sympathetic to mercenary activities. The Soldier of Fortune team were CIA assets being sent around the globe to fight communist forces in order for the CIA and the Reagan administration to get around the restrictions placed on them by Congress. I mean, think about it. Just think about it for a second. If the CIA would sell crack cocaine to its own citizens to fund the war against communists, is it that hard to believe they would also create a popular magazine to convince you that mercenaries were necessary in the fight against communism? Exactly. Well, that's the end of the video. Thank you all so much for tuning in today, man. Thank you if you made it all the way to the end of this video. This video took a lot of research, but I really did enjoy learning about all this new stuff, man. I had no idea that this is how the video would turn out when I picked this topic to make a video on it. And government, if you're out there listening, man, from the bottom of my heart, I really don't want any smoke with y'all at all. I'm just trying to make dope content. All this stuff is old from like, you know, the 40s on back. I found it all just through, simple Google searches. So I hope you ain't mad, man. I'm just trying to keep the people entertained, man. Ultimately, I appreciate everything you all do. I think, what you all did during the Cold War was absolutely necessary. I mean, did the government make mistakes? Absolutely. They're just human beings, but they got the whole fate of the country in their hands. I couldn't imagine that kind of pressure, man. I really couldn't. But as far as the Soldier of Fortune team is concerned, I think Robert and his whole squad are absolute badass motherfuckers, man. The world is much more interesting with people like that running around. It's also a lot more dangerous, but it is what it is. Please like, please subscribe, please comment if you haven't already. I hope that this video kept you entertained. But I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.